Hey everyone, welcome to the second week. I want to start out by acknowledging that the reading I've given you, this kind of somewhat heavy duty uh, cognitive science and developmental psychology, might not be what you expected from this course on non-fictional prose. I want to say, first of all, think it's good to be surprised. I think it's good to be to not get what you expect. Keeps you on your toes. That's going to be one of the themes of the class. Is sort of the value of surprise. Um, but there's an important lesson. This is not a class on developmental psychology or cognitive science, so I don't expect you to learn memorize all these details. Um, I want you to grasp a good deal of it, though, and but above all, I want you to grasp this fundamental point that language is not about, it is not exclusively about correct representation of the world or telling the truth. This is one thing that language pretends to do, and both Alison Gopnik and Ian McGilchrist argue that there's a power dynamic between the ostensible representation of truth, the ostensible purpose of language and communication, devoted to representing objective reality, and unspoken, implicit functions of language. This is a power dynamic that Alison Gopnik talks about in terms of the difference between children and adults, the different learning styles of children and adults, and in particular the neglected learning, the neglected intelligence of children. Here's a little animated lecture in which Ian McGilchrist discusses the basic thesis of his book, The Master and His Emissary. Couple points. The importance, first of all, of opposition, of contradiction. What makes a key part of, a defining feature of our brain is that it's split. We think of it as making connections. I think that's such a lovely point he makes. Like this organ, our intelligence, is all about making the world coherent and understandable, comprehensible, comprehending the world in a coherent intellectual system, and yet it's riddled with it's defined by this opposition, and is asymmetrical. And what he points out, and this is interesting, we're going to be talking about like artificial intelligence a little bit by and by, and the efficacy of oppositional systems. So it's a crucial part about the way the brain works is that there are oppositional systems. We have contradictory systems going on at the same time and trying to inhibit each other. So this kind of master-slave or master-emissary dynamic, this power dynamic, is really important to how our brain works, how we organize the world in general. I think it's really interesting. Again, we'll talk about this more, but we're so invested in coherence and straightness, making things right angles. Whereas I think what really makes us efficacious and successful, what makes it all, any animal successful, has to do with these opponent processes, asymmetry. Think of our handedness. It's so weird that we, have one hand that works better than the other. And it's usually the right hand, and that's a function of the dominance of the left brain, as Ian McGilchrist discusses. So here he describes the opponent processes, these two kinds of cognition, in terms of a bird eating. We have one kind of cognition that's about grasping, both literally and metaphorically. It's about finding ways to get things, conquer, acquire, prey. So this acquisitional, manipulating function, everything we associate with grasping and the right-handedness, is deeply characteristic of the left brain, whether we're talking about physical action in the world or intellectual or rhetorical, the work of a lawyer, winning an argument. This is about marshaling representational, repeatable tactics for manipulating and acquiring, possessing things in the world. But then at the same time, we have an entirely antithetical cognitive function. It's about environmental awareness, being aware in the moment, vigilant for surprises, surprise attacks, being open to the unforeseen, what we don't expect. And this is like embodied awareness. And so it's inarticulate. It's not, this experience of the right brain is not compatible with representation, because it's all about being in this attention to the particularity itself of the moment, each moment. Okay, so let's just look at a couple minutes of this, and hopefully this will help you grasp our opponent processes.
Because this organ, which is all about making connection, is profoundly divided. It's there inside all of us, and it's got more divided over the course of human evolution. So that the ratio of the corpus callosum to the volume of the hemispheres has got smaller over evolution. And the plot thickens when you realize that one of the main, if not the main, function of the corpus callosum is in fact to inhibit the other hemisphere. So something very important is going on here about keeping things apart from one another. And not only that, the brain is profoundly asymmetric. It's broader at the back on the left and broader on the right at the front, and slightly juts forward and backward. And it's as though somebody got hold of the brain from underneath and given it a sort of sharp twist clockwise. What is all that about? If one just needed more brain space, one would do it symmetrically. The skull is symmetrical. The box in which all this is contained is symmetrical. Why go to trouble to expand some bits of one hemisphere and some bits of another, unless they were doing rather different things? What are they doing? Well, it's not just we who have these divided brains. Birds and animals have them as well. I think the simplest way to think of it is if you imagine a bird trying to feed on a seed against the background of grit or pebbles. It's got to focus very narrowly and clearly on that little seed and be able to pick it out against that background. But it's also, if it's going to stay alive, it's got to actually keep a quite different kind of attention open. It's got to be on the lookout for predators or for friends, for conspecifics, but for whatever else is going on. It seems that birds and animals quite reliably use their left hemisphere for this narrow, focused attention to something it already knows is of importance to it. And they keep their right hemisphere vigilant broadly for whatever might be without any commitment as to what that might be. And they also use their right hemispheres for making connections with the world. So they approach their mates and bond with their mates more using the right hemisphere. But then you come to the humans. And it's true that actually in humans too, this kind of attention is one of the big differences. The right hemisphere gives sustained, broad, open vigilance, alertness, where the left hemisphere gives narrow, sharply focused attention to detail. And people who lose their right hemispheres have a pathological narrowing of the window of attention. But humans are different. The big thing about humans is their frontal lobes. And the purpose of that part of the brain? To inhibit the rest of the brain, to stop the immediate happening. So standing back in time and space from the immediacy of experience. And that enables us to do two things. It enables us to do what neuroscientists are always telling us we're very good at, which is outwitting the other party, being Machiavellian. And that's interesting to me, because that's absolutely right. We can read other people's minds and intentions, and if we so want to, we can deceive them. But the bit that's always curiously missed out here is that it also enables us to empathize for the first time, because there's a sort of necessary distance from the world. If you're right up against it, you just bite. But if you can stand back and see that other individual is an individual like me, who might have interests and values and feelings like mine, then you can make a bond. There's a sort of necessary distance, as there is in reading. Too close, you can't see anything. Too far, you can't read it. So the distance from the world that is provided is profoundly creative of all that is human, both the Machiavellian and the Erasmian. Now, to do the Machiavellian stuff, to manipulate the world, which is very important, we need to be able to interact with the world and use it for our benefit. Food is the starting point, but we also, with our left hemispheres, grasp, using our right hands, things and make tools. We also use that part of language to grasp things, as we say. It pins them down. So when we already know something's important and we want to be precise about it, we use our left hemispheres in that way. And to do that, we need a simplified version of reality. It's no good if you're fighting a campaign, having all the information on all the plant species that grow in the terrain of battle. What you need is to know the specifics of where certain things are that matter to you. And so you have a map and you have little flags. It's not reality, but it works better. The newness of the right hemisphere makes it a devil's advocate. It's always on the lookout for things that might be different from our expectations. It sees things in context. It understands implicit meaning, metaphor, body language, emotional expression in the face. It deals with an embodied world in which we stand embodied in relation to a world that is concrete. It understands individuals, not just categories. It actually has a disposition for the living rather than the mechanical. And this is so marked that even in a left-hander who is actually using their right hemisphere in daily life to manipulate tools with their left hand, it is their left hemisphere, not their right hemisphere, in which tools and machines are coded. So this is very interesting. And it changes the view of the body. The body becomes an assemblage of parts in the left hemisphere. If I had to sum it all up, I would get away from all those things that we used to say, reason and imagination. Let me make it very clear. For imagination, you need both hemispheres. Let me make it very clear. For reason, you need both hemispheres. So if I had to sum it up, I'd say the world of the left hemisphere, dependent on denotative language and abstraction, yields clarity and power to manipulate things that are known, fixed, static, isolated, decontextualized, explicit, general in nature, but ultimately lifeless. The right hemisphere, by contrast, yields a world of individual, changing, evolving, interconnected, implicit, incarnate, living beings within the context of the lived world, but in the nature of things never fully graspable, never perfectly known. And to this world it exists in a certain relationship. The knowledge that's mediated by the left hemisphere is, however, within a closed system. It has the advantage of perfection, but the perfection is bought ultimately at the price of emptiness. There's a problem here about the nature of the two worlds. They offer us two versions of the world, and obviously we combine them in different ways all the time. We need to rely on certain things to manipulate the world, but for a broad understanding of it, we need to use knowledge that comes from the right hemisphere. And it's my suggestion to you that in the history of Western culture, things started in the 6th century BC, in the Augustan era, and in the 15th, 16th century in Europe, with a wonderful balancing of these hemispheres. But in each case, it drifted further to the left hemisphere's point of view. Nowadays, we live in a world which is paradoxical. We pursue happiness, and it leads to resentment, and it leads to unhappiness, and it leads, in fact, to an explosion of mental illness. We've pursued freedom, but we now live in a world which is more monitored by CCTV cameras, and in which our daily lives are more subjected to what de Tocqueville called a network of small, complicated rules that cover the surface of life and strangle freedom. More information, we have it in spades, but we get less and less able to use it, to understand it, to be wise. There's a paradoxical relationship, as I know as a psychiatrist, between adversity and fulfillment, between restraint and freedom, between the knowledge of the parts and wisdom about the whole. It's that machine model again that is supposed to answer everything, but it doesn't. Think about this. Even rationality is grounded in a leap of intuition. There is no way you can rationally prove that rationality is a good way to look at the world. We intuit that it is very helpful. And this is not new. At the other end of the process, rationality, we know from Gödel's theorem, we know from what Pascal was saying hundreds of years before Gödel, that the end point of rationality is to demonstrate the limits to rationality. In our modern world, we've developed something that looks awfully like the left hemisphere's world. We prioritize the virtual over the real. The technical becomes important. Bureaucracy flourishes. The picture, however, is fragmented. There's a loss of uniqueness. The how has become subsumed in what. And the need for control leads to a paranoia in society that we need to govern and control everything. Why this shift? I think there are three reasons. One is the left hemisphere's talk is very convincing because it shaved everything that it doesn't find fits with its model off and cut it out. So this particular model is entirely self-consistent, largely because it's made itself so. I also call the left hemisphere the Berlusconi of the brain, because it controls the media. It's the one with which it's very vocal on its own behalf. The right hemisphere doesn't have a voice, and it can't construct these same arguments. And I also think, rather more importantly, there's a sort of hall of mirrors effect. The more we get trapped into this, the more we undercut and ironize things that might have led us out of it. And we just get reflected back into more of what we know about what we know about what we know. And I just want to make it clear, I'm not against whatever it is the left hemisphere has to offer. Nobody could be more passionate in an age in which we neglect reason and we neglect careful use of language. Nobody could be more passionate than myself about language and about reason. It's just that I'm even more passionate about the right hemisphere and the need to return what that knows to a broader context. It turned out that Einstein's thinking somehow presaged this thing about the structure of the brain. He said, the intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant, but has forgotten the gift.
Being in the moment. This is something that defies representation. It's about being present rather than represented. So this is a tricky philosophical point, and it makes us veer a little bit into poetry because we're talking about what can't be said in language. And I know when I say that, that's going to make some of you bristle and in skepticism. And I probably, as a undergraduate, certainly, in my first years, I think I was pretty one of those that was pretty I don't want to pretend that I was overly invested in school actually at that point, but I do remember having arguments with people where I remember having arguments with my girlfriend at the time that about the need to be objective, that we can't, if we just have, if everything's subjective, then we really can't communicate, or it's everything's relative. So we need, objectivity. Like we have to have, um, the authority of facts and objectivity and stuff. Um, I sympathize with that point of view, although I think it's wrong now. Maybe the simplest way to explain myself is to can tell you um, about my a bit about me. I I come from a family of psychologists. My mom, my dad, my second dad, stepdad, my grandpa were all psychologists, and so I and I think I inherited from them a fascination with psychology and behavior and how we work emotionally. Um, but I also rebelled against it somewhat, and in particular the um, uh, pretense to speaking authoritatively, the scientific pretense, thing to diagnosing people, um, really turned me off, and I think so I came to literature because that's what literature it is, basically, is psychology, but not from the objective perspective of science, but from the participant's perspective. What does it feel like to be human? What's again, going back to this formulation, what is the human experience, not from the view from the scientific view from nowhere, which, as Ian McGilchrist puts it, the view from nowhere, which pretends to be the view from everywhere, pretends to be a God's eye view, omniscient perspective on reality. That's sort of how psychologists struck me. Pretending to know you better than you do. But instead, what literature offers is a perspective from somewhere, from particular perspectives in the world. We learn from literature what it's like to be situated in life. And the experience of being situated is not something that can be represented. I I know that, again, may be hard for some of you to swallow. But the thought experiment I asked you to think about last time was, we are used to providing explanations for ourselves, and we can do that up to a certain point, but explaining ourselves thoroughly, I think we can't do that without resorting to poetry. Either resorting to poetry on the one hand, saying, what am I about? What am I here for? If you can offer a merely rational, logical explanation of yourself, then you have kind of canceled yourself, like what yourself as an individual. Where again, as you're to talk about your partner, your best friend, your family, what is it that ties you to them? In the end, you can give a lot of objective reasons, but in the end, it has to. I feel like we live in an individualistic culture where we demand of each other, finally, um, a unique justification of ourselves. What I'm about is not something that can be boiled down, reduced to a third personal explanation that would make me, that would basically be a recipe for me. And then, you could, you wouldn't need me anymore because you'd have a formula of what I'm about. Does that make sense? So what I'm saying basically is this first personal perspective, what it means, the view from somewhere. It's what we want for ourselves. It's part of the culture that we live in. Maybe it's not as much a part of other non-Western cultures. In any culture is sort of about what's the purpose of life, how do we find meaning, and I'm suggesting our culture it tells us that it's about being, finding some kind of personal project and meaning, and showing us models for doing that. And I think that's a big part of what literature is. One thing you notice if you look at literature, that prominent examples of fiction or non-fictional literature, is that as Tolstoy put it at the beginning of Anna Karenina, famously, that all happy families are alike. Unhappy families are each unhappy in their own way. It's to say that happiness is not that interesting, doesn't need to be talked about. It's it doesn't produce a lot of interesting communication, arguably, that we, as the philosopher Nietzsche put it, we just talk about what hurts, we just think about what hurts. If it doesn't hurt, it's kind of why bother? So we pay attention to what disrupts us, and forces itself on our attention, makes us work a little bit. I think we're fundamentally lazy in that sense, that if it's not broke, why bother paying attention to it? So that's to say, individuation, finding yourself, it involves a kind of struggle, usually of some kind. And I think another thing worth saying about myself, I imagine some of you at least will relate to, is I've kind of struggled with depression and anxiety for most of my life, and when I first one particular struggle I had with it was when I first started kind of learning about it. I read that depressed people actually have more kind of accurate perception of reality than non-depressed people do. Like, have a more accurate perception of the probability of things working out or not. And when I learned that, I found it pretty devastating, because it was sort of like saying, like, you're right to be depressed. This, you're perceiving things accurately, and I think, I think it's true. The If you take an objective view on things, it is arguably pretty depressing. But I then came to realize something that was actually very helpful for my personal, experience of depression, or working through it, which is realizing that life isn't about being correct. It's not about accurate, representation of reality. It's about communication, feeling a shared sense of purpose, feeling at home. These, arguably are illusions, delusions. Culture is largely about irrational, fantasies and irrational expectations, irrational exuberance. Um, I think that's, maybe a hard, thing to acknowledge, but in a way, I want to make the case in this class that it's actually, part of what's beautiful. These glorious fantasies that we pursue, just like, the way bird song much must sound to other birds, or flowers must, appear to pollinating insects, whatever. Um, it's not a it the if you think about it that way, it's the illusions that we have, or what hold us together, and that's it's so amazing that we have them, um, and so they're not to be disparaged or dismissed for being inaccurate. What wouldn't be inaccurate? What would accuracy be? Adequate representation of the truth of the universe or whatever, it would be pretty um, hard to fathom, um, if it canceled out, if it subtracted the that view from somewhere, that we're all inhabiting, all creatures filled with their own individual, delusions of purposeful life. That's all life is, and it's so wonderful to get to have a chance to participate in it. So that's what we're looking at in the various examples of nonfiction writing in this class. And Zadie Smith's account, writing is talking to yourself. Reading nonfiction writing is like overhearing someone talking to themselves. I think that's what reading in general is about. Feeling and writing, like if you write in a journal, um, why do you do that? What is that accomplishing? I think it's like reading, that it's participating in a kind of imaginary community. Language gives us this sense of community, of a kind of alliance of with a listener or a reader that would understand what we're saying. It's not just talking to ourselves, but being overheard talking to ourselves. And the sense of alliance that comes with that. So, I don't want to suggest that, truth doesn't matter, or the concern for accuracy. I mean, obviously, Zadie Smith is trying to, acknowledge hard truths about her world and her, reality, her kind of class position, her cultural pretensions, her status as a perimenopausal woman, um, are all aspects of this somewhere that she's speaking from. But what I think matters more, what matters ultimately, is this feeling of alliance. And what that requires in the end for Zadie Smith is saying, this is nonsense. I have an allegiance to a human experience, kind of truth of human suffering in the pandemic that makes, it, to I acknowledge the truth, my sense of that, the truth of that suffering, by saying my story is nonsense. I haven't approached that truth at all. So in a way, it's a manner of bearing witness to that truth by calling my own gesture nonsense. Um, but be clear. This is not. She publishes it. It's one poetic inflection she gives to the whole weave of her essay. And so it's like a piece of music that can kind of, it ends in a like swoon or sort of fatalistic resignation, but that's just one moment in a complex um, musical trajectory. And in a kind of dialectic, again, a kind of yin yang with that, what she calls the purpose of writing is, for the most part, controlling experience. It's very much, again, the point of Ian McGilchrist and Alison Gopnik, um, that language is about fixing, um, representing what's going on in a fixed, controlled way. And so Zadie Smith, by kind of throwing up her hands, I think it's also a symbolic gesture saying, I'm not in control. I'm this is me trying to deal with something so much bigger and respond to something so much bigger than me, so chaotic. Um, I'm I'm reflecting it by going through the motion of my own failure to control it. I wonder how many of you keep a journal. Um, it's something I'd encourage you to at least try. I was considering making it an assignment in the class, but I just feel like it's kind of hard to, evaluate. Um, and I mean, that's really part of the point is, you can't evaluate it. That your writing is not, again, about being accurate. Your TA can't look at your journal and say, no, you've written about yourself wrong. Um, and I think that's revealing. I mean, and maybe it gives some insight into what Zadie Smith means when she says by calling her essay nonsense, um, and that she's talking to herself. It's about a kind of, like a person talking to themselves. Like sometimes that's just crazy jibber jabber, right? Maybe it only means something to you and to no one else. Maybe it's even nonsense to you. Um, but I'm trying to suggest that there's something communicated nonetheless. It's like music communicates, but there's no, you can't nail it down to propositional statements in language. What it communicates moods and emotion So I think journaling has a lot more to do with just rather than getting it right, what's going on with your life, telling the correct story. Um, that it's about sort of experimentation, seeing how many different stories you can tell, how um, exploring, experimenting, uh, and discovering other perspectives on what's going on, other ways of describing, and that's can be incredibly empowering. Um, the freedom of writing um, otherwise, then it breaks you out of the kind of closed loops of representations, the repetitious stories that you tell about what you're doing, about who you are, um, and it may be, like Zadie Smith's piece, it might be nonsense in the end, but there's something liberating about discovering that flexibility. Um, Especially today, we live in a world where our predictability kind of precedes us. Like, we're, um, so much of our communication is mediated by these algorithms and stuff that are about predicting our behavior. And in Alison Gopnik's powerful set of oppositional terms, exploiting, profit maximizing what those predictions. Um, and that's very powerful kind of intelligence, the capacity to understand a system and exploit it. That's what we do. That's how we've conquered the planet, is by that kind of intelligence, discovering predictable patterns, and exploiting them for all they're worth. Um, but there's also something deadening about that, in respect to, again, our idea of being ourselves, being having a unique perspective, being here in the world and alive now. Um, Requires an open-endedness. The story is not foretold 100%. Um, if it is, then that sense of the significance of our own perspective on what's going on becomes irrelevant. Alison Gopnik has really an interesting discussion of artificial intelligence in this edge.org um, lecture. I encourage you to check out. She discusses the Turing test, named for Alan Turing, the um, inventor of the computer. One person that's credited with inventing the computer, cracking the German uh, code, secret code of encryption during the Second World War, um, for the British, repaid by the British government by being, virtually tortured to death for being a homosexual. He was chemically castrated, and he ultimately killed himself. Um, but he wrote about artificial intelligence and devised this idea, sort of thought experiment of that he called the Imitation Game, which is the name of the biopic about him, starring Benedict Cumberbatch. Gopnik talks a lot about imitation, as does Ian McGilchrist, as a really essential skill in human intelligence, especially the capacity of children for imitation, the way in which children just spontaneously absorb information and skills by imitating their parents and their peers. Even newborns, like 45 seconds old, like will imitate facial expressions and stuff. Um, Imitation is like evolution in real time. Like whereas the rest of the species have to evolve genetically through random mutation, and then whoever sort of succeeds comes up with advantageous mutations, succeeds over multiple generations. We can do it in an instant. Like we can, just by imitating who succeeds in real time, we can evolve ourselves. So we change our brains by behaving differently. Our brains actually develop differently. So imitation is really key to our success as a species, and is key to our identity, as people. That's what I've been talking about, really, is that our sense of ourselves is having a perspective, being alive here in the moment, reacting to the world moment to moment, spontaneously. Something we've learned to do through imitating. Really interestingly, especially in light of Turing's marginal sexual status, um, he invented this. He discussed the imitation game initially not in terms of artificial intelligence, but in terms of gender. The way the imitation game works. The criterion of artificial intelligence is that an actual intelligence would recognize a computer as a human. So there's no other real definition than to artificial intelligence than a functional one. Intelligence is what intelligence does, and but Turing initially said that about gender. Gender is what gender does. To be male or female is to be recognized as male or female, and nothing other. It's a social construct, a functional social norm. But Gopnik points out here that he also discusses children and suggests that maybe children are a better model. The intelligence of children is a better model for artificial intelligence to try to imitate, or to try to emulate, because the intelligence of adults ultimately is kind of mechanically replicable. I mean, I think that's the point about these algorithms that just predict our behavior. Because adults are so invested in kind of the authority of their own perspective and getting things right, that's why we're susceptible to confirmation bias. We just want to recognize things, acknowledge things that confirm what we already know. That makes us totally predictable and mechanical. So Turing asks, like Alison Gopnik, well, maybe that's not even that intelligent. Real artificial intelligence would be able to mimic the more flexible curiosity, experimentation, playfulness of children. And she even discusses the idea of teaching robots to play. So That is to perform random activities and see what happens and learn from random mistakes. That's what kids do. In fact, kids have not a confirmation bias, Gopnik points out, but a falsification bias. They're more interested in what falsifies what they already know. That's what makes them like good scientists, Gopnik points out, because they're always looking for counter evidence. So I think that's pretty interesting. And it's so especially, sad and powerful to realize how quick we are as adults to turn our backs on that mode of learning, and become invested in our intellectual authority, and one kind of dogmatic understanding of how the world works. And so the point here, the general point that I'm deriving from Gopnik and McGilchrist and Turing is this dogmatism reflects social biases. So what gets confirmed in the confirmation bias is, the perspective of science, the view from nowhere, objectivity, and that also has social ramifications. It's usually also the perspective of men, the patriarchy, and there are all sorts of perspectives that are excluded, beginning with women, but minorities, defined in terms of the body. Racial minorities, different embodied perspective, different material perspectives than the one aligned with the view from nowhere. The objective view from nowhere. The view from somewhere. The somewhere is always considered somehow delegitimizing a particular context. And that makes everyone at odds with themselves, not just women and other people of minority embodiment, but people of embodiment in general. White men have bodies too, which contradict their own pretensions to intellectual authority. There are no straight lines in nature. And as philosopher Kant put it, there's nothing straight has ever been made from the crooked timber of humanity. We're all crooked. I think that's so key to bear in mind, that we have these fundamental, beginning with the letter I, like that this belief in something that never appears in the world, the straight line, that organizes our world, so our experience. So in a way, we're like perpetually at odds with ourselves, in that we're viewing the world through a lens, demanding of the world a straightness that doesn't exist. It's sort of a recipe for torture. So torture of oneself and everything else. So again, that's what I'm trying to get you to think about in terms of nonfiction prose, is the way it registers, it tries to bring into the domain to of fact or truth or reality or objectivity, that crookedness that we usually exclude, the awareness of context, of embodied experience that usually goes unrecognized and unspoken. How do we do that? And again, I think journal writing is a great exercise in just to enriching, playing with your kind of automatic under intellectual objective understanding of what's going on. Think about how embodied experience, how Zadie Smith makes us aware of a kind of embodied experience indirectly. You know, the embodied, the being a perimenopausal woman, her relationship to her body is kind of, pervasive, and that, and she talks a lot about how for so long she resisted that and didn't want to acknowledge it. And so that's sort of a subtext that's pressing on her prose there, this sort of acceptance of her own gendered body. And then the disease, like the way the embodied experience of disease presses upon the text. Okay, looking forward to talking to you more on Wednesday.